Hi, we will begin. You know, I initially tried to persuade Anish and then Sukumar to chair the session, but only because, if I introduce Janicki, it is going to be slightly long. So you will have to bear with
Keep
me
it
then.
short.
As short as possible. Yeah. So, hi. Yeah. Uh, speakers are usually of three types. There are those who require introductions, there are those who don't require introductions, and then there are those who don't require introductions but should nonetheless be introduced. And Professor Janicki Nair falls in the last category. She's a prolific writer. We know she's the author of 4 monographs and a host of edited books, book chapters, and articles. Apart from her purely scholarly engagements, she writes frequently in newspapers and participates enthusiastically in public debates. Um, in recent years, particularly, unhappy developments have inspired her into political activism much more deeply, much to the chagrin of the powers that be. Most importantly, her work is a straightforward challenge to those who consider scholarly work in ivory towers of university spaces and active engagement in pressing political debates as contradictory and incompatible preoccupations. Professor Nair obtained her master's in modern history at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, before moving to Syracuse University for a PhD. Thereafter, she has served in a number of research institutions such as MIDS Chennai, CSCS Bangalore, CSSS Kolkata, before returning to Jawaharlal Nehru University as Professor of Modern Indian History in 2009. Janicki will be retiring from CHS in January next year. And despite protests from many of her students, including myself, she is determined to move back to her hometown in Bangalore. Delhi's loss is Bangalore's gain. Without any further delay, let us welcome Professor Janicki Nair.
Thank you, Ishan, for that very warm welcome. And I have to say that I was exiled from Bangalore, so it's not like I left voluntarily. So, of course, I'm happy to go back there. And in fact, that brings me straight to what I'm going to present, because is there anybody here from Karnataka? Okay, that's not so bad. Usually you don't find too many people. I only say this because perhaps some of the themes I'm discussing, and certainly some of the names I will be using, are going to be unfamiliar to most of you. So that's the only reason there is a PowerPoint, because there is something to just show you some of these terms. This is a piece of work that a piece of work, or a body of work, I should say, that I have been engaged with over the last 10 years or so, and it is in close collaboration with 2 or 3 mathas in Karnataka. Some of you may already be aware that the matha plays a very important role in contemporary Karnataka, and it was that important role that led me to look at some of these questions historically. This particular paper actually is dealing with the question of rights to honors in public spaces, which sort of broke out with a certain ferocity at the end of the 19th century and continued into the first couple of decades of the 20th. Now, I have a written paper, but I'm not going to always stick to it, because I think it'll be more interesting if I speak in between. But I'll start by reading this, because one of the things, and this is actually something that's going to shortly appear in the Indian Economic and Social History Review. I'll start with this because along the way, while I was writing this paper, it occurred to me that there is a very stark difference between the North Indian monastic institutions and their history in the South. So it's it's the point on which I actually begin, and I would like to just read this first part. Rallying around the cow and the sectarian strife that followed may well have preoccupied most of North and Central India in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as many scholars have shown. At a time when the divisive legacies of this inaugural moment are being generously shared across the Indian subcontinent, it is vital to provincialize that history through a reminder of other peninsular preoccupations. In fin de siècle Mysore, a princely state under indirect British rule, there was much more rallying around the cow's tail, and I'm not being sarcastic here. It was the yak's tail, which was actually something which was called Ubhaya Chamara, as interminable rivalries of prestige gathered obsessive force within and between its matas, which, as you know, are Hindu monastic institutions. Battles about honors and insignia, which in Kannada is called Birudugalu, or sometimes Maryadai, which is simply honors, that accompanied the gurus on their peregrinations, raged in the streets, clogged the courtrooms, and furrowed the brows of Mysore bureaucrats. These sectarian rivalries did not lead to the bloodletting characteristic of the Indo-Gangetic region, as caste communities asserted their right to processional honors, fighting for new degrees of parity and visibility, vigorously reinscribing custom and right. What do these contexts and contests tell us about the birthing of a new public as the Mata transformed itself in the time of modernity, engaging with the bureaucracy as a modernizing force on the one hand, and with emerging forms of caste publics on the other? So this paper actually focuses on new ideas of publicness that were elaborated when the Mysore bureaucracy, the Mata itself, and its adherents redefined claims to authority and legitimacy, sometimes appealing to the court as the final arbiter in times of conflict. The state's ranking of matas according to age and wealth into a single and therefore comparable index was the first such attempt at defining matas as public institutions. Secondly, fervid claims to antiquity, eager participation in the state's demand for documents, and the routinization of the charisma of the guru gave the Mata a new visibility. And finally, emerging ways of collective belonging among adherents, symbolized as a public, both drew on and remained at a remove from its caste identity, defining a new socially purposive public life for the Mata. And I argue, of course, that this has had important resonances up to the present day. Now, one of the first such battles between matas that broke out in Mysore and went up all the way to the Privy Council was one between the Sringeri Mata, which, as you perhaps already know, is the most important Brahmin Mata. So I should just, by way of introduction, also say that there are two important communities in Mysore that have matas. One are, of course, the Brahmins, and the second are the Lingayats. Of late, and this is a separate history and it's a separate line of research, so I'm not going to go into it here. Of late, practically every caste community has shown extraordinary interest in having a mata of its own. So there is something about that institutional structure that has attracted even those caste communities which have a long history of caste associations. So clearly the caste association alone is not enough for a certain claim to legitimacy within the public sphere amongst caste communities. So practically every caste community today is engaged in this battle about how to be publicly acknowledged as having its own mata. But as I said, I'm not going into that. I'm going into a prior moment when the battles are actually being staged between Brahmin matas, in particular of Sringeri, and Lingayat matas, which are on the rise. So this particular battle to which I refer, which may well be the first court battle, was in 1836, and it was a claim that the Sringeri Mata made for damages of 15,000 rupees, and we are talking about 1836, so of course it's not a small amount, from Dharwar court, from a Lingayat guru who had been carried crosswise into Hubli town. Crosswise, it is called the Addapaliki. Let me see if I can show you an image of this. Sorry, this is... Okay, so I'm just showing you a quotation actually of an introduction to the book on Mathas written by M.M. Kalburgi, who was very much engaged in the history of Lingayats before his insurgent knowledges actually led to his murder in 2015. So this is actually talking about the distinction between ashram and matha. It's the renunciant who's in the ashram and it's the devotee in the matha. This is just a Kannada phrase. Let me see if I can show you an Addapaliki image, which just to give you an idea of, that's it. Okay, so this is the cross palanquin. So as you can see, it is intended to block the entire street when it is carried crosswise. Now this case, which I'm referring to, was dismissed with costs since the Sringeri Matha was unable to produce documentary evidence of exclusive right to the privilege. So the argument that was being made by Sringeri Matha was that only Sringeri Matha was entitled to use the Addapaliki or the cross palanquin in public spaces, and that the Lingayat Matha had no business entering town on this cross palanquin. But as I said, the Privy Council did not overturn the lower court's decision, and that went its own way. By the middle of the 19th century, the Addapalaki, the cross palanquin, had acquired a new kind of aura as it entered a very embattled phase of its existence. As a royal honor, it's a Raja Birudu, it had occupied the pinnacle of processional honors, which a guru in Mysore could claim while on tour, and was freighted with as much mystique as its occupant. But it also began to embody the paradoxes posed by modernity to the dense network of mathas in the Mysore region. The cross palanquin became an object of desire for mathas great and small, since it represented the power of monopolizing, indeed blocking the street while in procession. But it was the very publicness, therefore presumed neutrality of the street space to which other mathas were beginning to make their claims. You can immediately see that this is slightly contradictory. The street space began to vie with the palanquin as generative of the rights bestowed, not by the reigning monarch in Mysore, but by his bureaucracy. The well-publicized journey of the Guru to different parts of the state was undertaken to fulfill the mundane duties of administering his flock of adherents, to adjudicate on achara vichara cases, which are customs and norms of behavior, to receive fees from pupils, shishyarjane, and to collect donations, kanike. Proliferating disputes over his peregrinations presented an administrative challenge, since a new symbolic economy was in the making. So you have by 1932 a manual of birudus and other honors being compiled by the Muzrai commissioner, which is a culmination of all these tortured discussions. Who has access to which honors and in which time of year or which space? These are things which had to be presented in some connected form in order for the administration to make the decisions that they had to make. The manual revealed that the Mysore bureaucracy understood well the ordering force of display and monopolized its regulation. Far from being too inflexible or redundant at a time of more deliberative forms of social organization and solidarity, these public rituals generated disputes on a scale and intensity that revealed the opposite. Their stylized, repetitive quality was crucial to cohering and sometimes producing caste communities. Claims to processional honors neither harked back to an older order, nor were they resisting the modern Mysore bureaucracy. Instead, they were precisely ways of engaging with and participating in the modern. So, how have these battles over honors been understood? I'll just briefly mention here, there are other scholars who have, of course, looked at this question and have suggested the symbolic representation of the Mathadipati, who is the chief abbot, as it were, of the Matha, as symbols of shared sovereignty, since many important Mathas were referred to as little kingdoms, samsthanams. And the Swami himself often took on the title of a king or a world guru. Jagadguru. So Jagadguru was, of course, quite a common term for some of the most important Mathadipatis. So these practices suggest some kind of an active sharing of power between king, state, and the Mathas. But I am actually arguing rather for against, as it were, the shared continuities of such power across political regimes. And I'm looking rather at the shifts that are actually occurring within princely Mysore at a time when the bureaucracy is actually emerging as perhaps the most important actor in the decisions about what the form and shape of public order and ceremony in Mysore should be. I won't go into the history of how these mathas. So one of the unusual things about Mysore, I should mention right at the outset, is, and this is to me an indication of the strength and power of this bureaucracy which emerges from the 1880s, is that all institutions which are supported by the state have been organized under a separate branch of the bureaucracy called the Muzrai Department. And the Muzrai Department, so this bureaucratic organization of the Muzrai Department has its origins actually in the time of Tipu Sultan. So I'll go back here to show you that this is the word is coming from Tipu Sultan's time for grants made in ready money and in land to temples, mathas, chatrams, dargahs, masjids, etc. So it's an unusual state simply because it has a separate bureaucratic department which continues up to the present day, which looks at, or rather organizes the affairs of the mathas. Mathas among others, as you can see, it also includes masjids, dargahs, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into the details of this bureaucratizing moment, but I should say that they were strictly under the control of the Mysore government. And in 1883, you have the appointment of a Muzrai superintendent to oversee reforms in temples and matha management. Soon after he assumed charge, he abolished the Devdasi performance tradition. This is something I have discussed elsewhere, so I will not go into the details of this. And it is actually seen as something that is crucial to the functioning of Mysore as a progressive state itself. So, for instance, they argue that the Muzrai Department is as important to the image of Mysore as a progressive state as its other states indeed. So in Mysore, therefore, the detailed supervision of religious and charitable institutions, including mathas, became a uniquely regular duty of government officers at the district and taluk levels. D.E. Smith notes that the minuteness of detail in arrangements continued well into the 1930s. Under the Muzrai Commissioner, officials inspected and controlled all religious institutions in their jurisdiction, settled questions of hereditary succession, managed the personnel of these institutions, fixed the scale of their expenditures, and sometimes sanctioned additional expenditure, maintained a register of temple jewels, along with the right of inspection. By the third decade of the 20th century, Muzrai Ilakhe had become a regular government department, exhaustively listing all the mathas under its wing, and that is why it is such a wonderful archival resource, because we have access, of course, to all the debates and discussions regarding these mathas. The matha, in turn, established its own practices and claims to by absorbing to itself all the powers of the sovereign, the Mysore state chopped down any basis for shared sovereignty while encouraging competition between mathas over the powers and perquisites that it distributed. The matha, in turn, established its own practices and claims to legitimacy by claiming antiquity and participating in this newly emergent document Raj. At the heart of the clamor for honors was a paradox. Since honors were by definition relational, permission to use some insignia was equally a right to deny others the privilege of using or displacing the same. The scarcity value of honors was therefore negotiated, maintained, and adjudicated between the bureaucracy and its court. The financial secretary of the Muzrai Commission in 1930 asserted that it is not open to any matha to say what honors should or should not be allowed to another matha. That was entirely the prerogative of the bureaucracy alone. In these struggles, predictably, history became a valuable resource, and as at least Prithvidatta Chandrashobhi has argued, the origins of Lingayat Mathas from the 15th century became crucial to defining a caste identity in the 19th and 20th centuries. It also played a very important role in building and sustaining consensus within the community on doctrinal matters. Although it is difficult to trace the existence of the Lingayat Matha before the 15th century, the demands of the Mysore bureaucracy from the late 19th century led to innovative historical claims. And as I said, one of the earliest sets of debates, or rather I should say contests, and these went into the court, as I have already explained, was between the two important Lingayat Mathas of Chitradurga district, in a place called Sirigere, not to be confused with Sringeri. So the debate was with Sringeri, but the mathas were in a place called Sirigere. The older Murugarajendra Matha and the slightly and the Balehalli Lingayat Mathas were vying for honors which were bestowed on the higher ranked Brahmin Mathas. Predominantly urban and dominated by the merchant Banajigas. So this is also important, that these mathas are expressions of certain kinds of economic and social power that is actually revealing itself in the 19th century. So these are actually merchant Banajigas who did not want their Lingayat caste community to be in any way divided by these upcoming subsects of Lingayats called the Sadars and the Nonabars, who are primarily peasant castes, but nevertheless who are seeking to accumulate certain kinds of social capital, and in this case, trying to build mathas of their own. So claims to antiquity are continuously being made by these mathas in order to establish their legitimacy as new institutions who have the right to not only what is called the ordinary honors. So there are three sets of honors I should explain at the outset. The Raja Birudu, which are the royal honors, and then you have the exceptional honors, and then you have the ordinary honors. So in each case, the Matha is trying to define its legitimacy by seeking higher and higher honors. And needless to say, it is the Brahmin Mathas who enjoy, as it were, the royal honors. So what is happening here, to cut a very complicated and long story short, is that there is this debate about whether you can produce the necessary documents to prove your antiquity. What might these documents be? They would be the sanads which have been issued by the Maharaja himself. In this case, Maharaja Krishnaja Wadiyar III, who was a relatively powerless king, because by 1831 the state of Mysore is taken over for direct British rule until 1881. So for a 50-year period, it is in the hands of direct British control, and Krishnaja Wadiyar's power was very, very limited. But nevertheless, he was the figurehead to which people turned in order to establish their claim to having a matha from at least the early 19th century. So it's from the early 19th century that you see this clamor for establishing mathas emerging, at least in the public documentation, and also therefore the clamor for these honors. Are you carrying the honors authorizedly or unauthorizedly? These were kinds of questions that kept coming up in order to make these claims to legitimate power which was visible in the sanads that were produced before the courts or the bureaucracy, as the case may be. Mathas therefore became adept at producing documents, including those that set limits to community assertion or aspiration. And I'd like to discuss a little bit in detail the debate between two old and two new Lingayat Mathas in the same district of Chitradurga. The Murgi and Balehalli Mathas on the one hand, which were the older Mathas, and the two upstart Sirigiri Mathas in claiming what the lower-ranked Sadars and Nonabars had been historically denied, namely a right to a Matha of their own. And a series of documents were produced to support not the new Mathas, but to support the argument of the old Mathas that they had been denied the right to establish a Matha of their own by a Nirup in 1812, by an 1825 document in 1825, and an 1838 document. So all of these were used to testify against the Sadars and the Nonabars for having a new Mathadipati of their own. Even prior to 1812, they argued, the king had denied peasant castes the permission to establish a separate Matha. But the interesting thing is, of course, that the modern bureaucratic state appeared to be much more sympathetic to this emerging idea of self-definition by a caste public. Many Mathas that were initially at pains to attribute their entitlements to the royal Nirup quickly learned that government orders, to which the Maharaja's signature was merely an ornament, could decide their fate. And what is emerging here is a new matrix of abstract legality and legitimation that was generated, which weakened the mere historical document. The two older Mathas of Murgi and Balehalli vociferously argued that civil courts are not the proper authorities to deal with questions of this kind related to insignia in public places. Yet they admitted that in the absence of a royal sanad, government alone could assign insignia. How then did the powers variously of the Amaldar, the deputy commissioner, the district collector, the chief court, the diwan stack up? Were the courts merely affirming already existing rights, or were they generating them? What was the source of original authority, the government or the court of law? These were the questions which actually marked these debates. The Murgi and the Balehalli Mathas were haunted by the fear that vesting the bureaucracy or the court with generative powers could lead to the proliferation of demands for more Mathas and public honors. They complained to the Maharaja directly in 1908 that apart from the two heretical Mathas already in existence in Sirigiri, there was yet another at Sanehalli which was seeking a license, as it were, to set up a Matha. They pleaded that licenses will be mistaken to have the effect of creating rights which a royal sanad alone can confer, leading to defiance and unauthorized use of honors. Yet the Murgi Matha itself had straddled both horses, since it had long urged the state to end exclusion, seeking parity with higher-ranked Brahmin Mathas. So what you can see is a sort of a turning of events. Exactly the same strategy that had been used by the higher-ranked Lingayat Mathas against the Brahmins was now being used by lower-ranked Lingayat Mathas against higher-ranked Lingayat Mathas, and was being resented because, as I said, it was very necessary to cling to the exclusive privilege to use some of these honors at this time. Still, not only were new spaces opening up for the display and performance of power, but new kinds of privileges and honors were being defined. In 1908, the Muzrai department issued an order upholding the chanting of the Vedas in the public street, and the Swami of Sirigiri styling himself as a Jagadguru, despite the objection of the Brahmins of Dorguni, Bagalkote, Athene, this is one region, a case we shall return to below. The Mathas had thus become adept at depending on the matter at hand. In 1893, the government of Mysore laid out 3 steps in the case of a controversy. First, a strict conformity to mamul or usage. So the question of custom is also coming up here as a source of a claim to legitimacy. And second, there was equally strict punishment for those breaking such customs or usages. And finally, if Mamul could not be established, then the same should be established by a decree of a competent civil court. So as you can see here, the terms of this legitimacy for mathas are clearly shifting away from the hands of the sole sovereign, namely the Maharaja, in issuing, as it were, these sanads and nirups, to a host of bureaucratic officials who can in turn issue licenses, freedom to travel on the streets of the state, and also by civil courts who are able to give, as it were, these decisions which would clearly set some of these mathas on the path to their own independence. A clear confirmation of the supreme power of the government was the invention of an entirely new entity out of a nondescript matha shrouded in controversy at Adi Chunchandgiri. Adi Chunchandgiri has recently come into the news because its Mathadipati, Nirmalananda, has had his telephone tapped by the Mysore government, by his name being included in the list of red sander smugglers. So this you may or may not have come to your notice, but it is of course a big thing in Karnataka that he was actually under surveillance because he was seen as someone slightly threatening, partly because, and here I should say again to bring the caste question into the foreground, he represents a caste which did not traditionally have mathas, the Vokaliga caste, and it is at this precise moment that Adi Chunchandgiri is emerging as the matha of the Vokaligas, that is to say in the late 19th century. So a clear confirmation of this supreme power of the government in creating these mathas is saying, for instance, as this Lingegowda said, there are hardly any records in the Math relating to its previous history, and there is nothing definitely defining exactly the rights and privileges of the Math, which is completely contrary to what two other bureaucrats had found regarding voluminous records through which they investigated the charges against, believe it or not, Adityanath. Now, Adityanath also, by the way, belongs to this Nathpanthi tradition, and it's a branch of that Nathpanthi tradition that eventually becomes the Vokaliga Matha in Karnataka. And I'll come to Adityanath and his rather colorful life in a moment. But there is a voluminous record, but it was convenient for those making their argument for this matha to be converted into Vokaliga matha in 1926 to say there really wasn't much of a historical record, because it was an embarrassing record to, as it were, recall. So there is this debate. It's not only that you produce historical documents, but that you suppress them as well. Here, in this course of setting yourself onto these the path to being an independent matha. The other set of questions around which there were serious quarrels were, of course, whether or not you should have the royal or the special honors, as well as the processional paraphernalia beginning in the early 20th century of such things as motor cars and bicycles. And finally, one of the most prestigious honors was exemption from personal appearance in civil courts. Now, this was an honor for which everybody fought. If you were considered really prestigious, if you could avoid appearing in civil courts for cases which concerned your matha. So this was again itself turning into a prestige and honor of its own. I would like to move to the question of how there is, in this period, also a second move that is happening, as it were, of the routinization of the charisma of the Swamiji or the Ayya. He is sometimes called Ayya, he is called Swamiji, he is called Mathadipati, any one of these things, which is happening in a number of ways. And it's happening through the bureaucratization of offices in precisely the kinds of ways that Max Weber had outlined for us. If prominent male adherents staged the selection of Mathadipatis, the Muzra Ilakhe now routinized such selection by defining the qualities which equipped him for a position of authority. The exemption of heads of 9 institutions from appearance in civil courts in 1886 were emphatically personal and not hereditary entitlements. The assessment of character by the Muzrai department took several forms. First, the leadership of the Matha was adjudged against a new morality, as happened at the time of the succession to the Adi Chunchanagiri Matha in 1892-93. An aspirant, Balaknatha, in a telegram to the Diwan of Mysore, claimed that wicked persons had elected another person after the death of his father, because Balaknath's own ancestry was somewhat dubious, because he was the son of a Basavi, a kept woman of Jeernath, who was Sundarnath's predecessor, etc. What he's basically trying to say was that he was a serious contender for the post, and the election of Adityanath as Ayya by the male devotees was wrong, but eventually it was upheld. Before long, in 1898-99, petitions against the mismanagement by Adityanath of the Matha and the temple began reaching the Muzrai department. In his complaint of 1899, a devotee named Lingana complained that the jewels of the temple had been misappropriated. Though he was supported, so here you have another phenomenon which is emerging, which is petitions signed by people who declare themselves as adherents of the Matha, thousands of them actually signing these petitions, asking for a change in Ayya, or at least asking for the Ayya to produce the authority under which he claimed the management of the temple. And the government actually intervened in a way that actually took away the right of the Ayya to collect even his kanikes and his offerings. So it was a very serious kind of intervention that was made by the Mysore state in this instant. By 1904, the lands were returned to the Matha, but by 1906, alarm bells began ringing again over the abuses prevailing both in the Matha and in the temple. There was a clamor for a greater role to be played by the public, and devotees numbering between 20 and 30,000, with an insistence on the accountability of the Ayya and the Pujari. The Muzrai department, though unable to effect a change of headship, contemplated checks and restrictions on the exercise of his powers. Although Adityanath continued as Ayya until 1915 and even selected his successor, his many misdemeanors had invited the scrutiny of not just government but a deliberative public as well. Sthaniks and devotees recorded the Guru's misdemeanors of the last 50 years, of which the apogee had been reached in Adityanath. So there had been a series of rather dubious characters heading this Chunchanagiri Matha, and Adityanath was, of course, the most recent. His misdemeanors included open adultery with loose women, his openly visiting toddy and arak shops in the neighborhood of the Matha, his shooting of the sacred bull of the temple, and the monkeys on the hill when he was drunk. And therefore, no wonder that the first member of the council noted that and he is noting this in 1929, almost 30 years after the series of events has already happened. No wonder then, the incumbents of the headship of the Matha have been for a long time persons quite unworthy of position held by them, as they possessed neither learning nor character. Now, it is these two things, learning and character, that are being testified to by the Mysore state. Are you fit to head a Matha, both on your acquisition of knowledge, and this, I'll sort of, cut down a longer part of this paper by saying that what is now being taken as evidence of your learning is your having actually passed these Sanskrit exams in government-recognized institutions. So it's no longer something that you can claim as something which you have control over, but something which is actually testified publicly. And of course, the question of character is one that also precludes and excludes possibilities of, derangement. So when the Sringeri Matha, for instance, is headed by a Mathadipati who is clearly deranged, there is extraordinary concern in the corridors of power in Mysore. There is even an anxiety about his successor and so on. So what I'm giving you is a sense of the kind of extent to which the bureaucracy is actually concerned about the headship of these mathas, and the ways in which the bureaucracy is bringing that into a certain kind of bureaucratic routine which can be established through publicly verifiable means. In this case, as I said, by certificates from Sanskrit institutions and so on and so forth. And there are things that the Mathadipatis are also doing by way of penance and so on, which are eccentric and which are also recorded very carefully, precisely because they don't fall into the same kind of, what the government actually would like them to do. But there is at least those eccentric sorts of, for instance, one of them is engaged in writing repeatedly in several volumes a certain kind of prayer and so on. So, there is always this, there is an indication clearly of very new demands and pressures that are being exerted on the Mathadipati to make himself accountable to the public. So it's really that I'm focusing on, is this accountability question, because it leads me to the third aspect of this formation of the public, which is called the inheritance of caste and the formation of a new public. Uday Kumar discussed the emergence in the early 20th century Kerala of new and conflicting notions of the public. When he says public here denotes the people as separate from the state, indicating a situation of political existence. The drawing of the line that carves out the public as a distinguishable, thinkable entity is always a political act. Emerging ideas of community, he noted, were necessarily moored in ascribed ideas of caste, while straining to define more universalist aspirations in order to avert becoming a tool in the service of jati identity. No strong, single anti-caste movement, such as that of Narayana Gurus, questioned the social and ethical space of Mysore's religious institutions. We do not have a comparable caste movement to what happens in Kerala. Yet, as we have seen so far, there were clear intimations of the emergence of new social and communitarian identities. The performative aspects of this identity, far from denying, undermining, or questioning caste, as was the case in Kerala, announced the anxieties and aspirations of a public in the process of converting its traditional caste inheritance into a form of capital, which, while not quite attaining the status of secular modern casteless capital, certainly paved the way for this by fashioning in a place in a new, if restricted, modern order. Caste associations and mathas. So the caste association has a longer history in contemporary Karnataka, as I said, than we find in perhaps other parts of the country. But for the non-Brahmin, particularly Lingayat mathas, ways of being modern implies strengthening links to the matha, not relinquishing them. The samaja or the sangha gave adherents relative autonomy, including critique of the perceived moral depravities of the matha, as happened in the pages of Mysore Star between 1920 and 22. Mysore Star was a newspaper which was dominated by the Lingayats. Sampad Abhyudaya was a journal which was dominated by the Brahmins. Needless to say, there was an ongoing battle between both these papers, which are respectively touting the positions of their caste public. But the matha was under severe scrutiny by this emerging new caste public to say that, there should be something that actually is a kind of a public control over the mathas, not just governmental control, but public control. The verve with which the predominantly middle-class caste, male and largely landowning elites laid claim to and represented the matha simultaneously buttressed and contested what the state had achieved through bureaucratization, enumeration, and an insistence on institutional accountability. The battles of the Murgi and Balehalli mathas on the one hand and the old and new Sirigiri mathas on the other were not merely over the place of the lower ranked Sadars and Nonabars within a larger Lingayat community. nor was it to mimic the high-ranked Lingayats, as those pulling away from the Moola or root Matha quickly revealed. In rejecting the affiliation but not the form when they set up the alternatives, lower-ranked castes not only expressed their growing economic clout but also channeled their secular aspirations through the Matha. Cases relating to the right to insignia by smaller caste groups crowded the courts as fierce battles broke out over the control of Matha and its properties. I suggest that the consolidation of publicness happened at least at 3 levels. The first drew, as we have seen throughout, on secular infrastructure being provided by the state to make a claim for formal equalities of a largely symbolic kind. A case in point was the conflict between Brahmins and Banajiga Lingayats, which had been simmering since as early as 1872 regarding the celebration of the Kama festival on the streets of a small town called Honali. Things came to a head in 1891 when the Deputy Commissioner placed restrictions on Brahmins due to objections from the Banajigas. Though it was amicably settled, the Brahmins appealed in 1893 to remove the restrictions. This compelled the Banajigas to display their own growing municipal power by their public passage through the town. While affirming the publicness of the road, the state declared that the Peta is a public street open to every class or person for every legitimate use, and the government is always anxious that such use should be regulated according to mamul or custom. Yet they cannot, that is to say the government, they cannot tolerate any prohibition or restriction of such use merely for the purpose of enabling one class to gratify itself, to gratify its ill feeling towards another. Finally, times and routes were decided for both types of celebrations, and both parties were advised to observe to strict mamul until custom was decided by the civil court. A few years later, in 1908, the government showed no hesitation in asserting the rights of non-Brahmins to the streets. When the Brahmins and other communities objected not only to the procession of the Lingayat Jagadguru through the streets of Chitradurga, Shimoga, Kadur, Hassan with music, but also to the chanting of the Vedas by the Lingayats in the public streets, the government of Mysore said the Dharmashastras may prohibit a Brahmin from hearing the Vedas chanted by a Lingayat, but such chanting in the public streets violates no right of the Brahmin, which can be upheld by government or by a court of law. So clearly they are throwing themselves behind the lower caste assertion, which insists on chanting the Vedas in these public streets. Now, the second register on which publicness was defined was vis-a-vis the community as a mobilizable entity. The powers bestowed on communities by the introduction of forms of enumeration are too well known to bear repetition here. The battle of numbers, which had been rehearsed in many parts of the country under colonial rule, particularly over issues of social and cultural reform, took shape in Mysore around the membership of Mathas. Public opinion, rather than scriptural text, was gaining ground as the basis on which decisions relating to succession were decided, as happened in Murgi Matha in 1896. Now, one of the most striking mobilization of numbers to buttress a cause of an already well-formed political group lay in the claim to a Matha in 1928, and this is the one I referred to slightly earlier, the Chunchungiri Matha, which in 1928 is being turned into the Matha of the Vokligas. And it is being done with official sanction. By this time, I should also mention, there were a large number of Vokligas in the Mysore bureaucracy. They played no small hand in determining the fate of this Matha. There were also people who were intellectuals who were engaged in, as it were, marshalling their numbers. The developing links between nascent politicians, government bureaucrat, and the Matha was made public during this succession. Gurram Appa was confirmed under supervision of B. Ramaya, who was the superintendent of the Muzrai Secretariat, on the invitation of the Congress politician K. H. Ramaya, who was also a local notable. So there is a nice kind of nexus emerging between a political party, the bureaucracy, and of course the adherents of the Matha itself. And it's the same Pandal where the Matadipati is affirmed as the head of this Mata that is used the very next day for the Vokliga conference, which is a public political conference and which is supported by the Congress. The role of caste publics in asserting their right over existing public services such as roads, wresting control of religious institutions such as temples and matas, is however only a partial account of the specific forms taken by the new publicness. The third and most significant way in which the mata was made to serve the emerging community and its secular demands was the demand that the mata enable access to general education. So here again you have something very specific happening in the Mysore case, where the mata as a monastic institution which has had a very long existence, as you know, and has as its founding principle the promotion of learning, now begins a very active engagement with the social world. Now there are some hints that the models are also borrowed from Christian missionaries who are active in Mysore right from the early part of the 20th century. But nevertheless, it is a very unusual feature of matas, which in our present day, as you know, has led to the extraordinary rise of the private institution in Mysore from the 1970s, providing technical and professional education on a scale that was unknown in other parts of India before the 1970s. So it has its roots actually in the kind of outreach that the matas make in the early 20th century for general education as a demand of its public. At first drawn into providing facilities to their adherents who attended government schools in Mysore towns and villages through the construction of hostels. The hostel is a very key element in this transition from the mata as a monastic institution with exclusive rights and privileges to one that is engaging with the public. And finally, of course, to the establishment of institutions themselves. And they were therefore actually praised even in the 1930s for the kind of active role they are playing in the establishment of these institutions. And there are many kinds of interesting stories told by different matas. I'll just cite one from the Suttur Mata, which is one in Mysore. A junior Swamiji of the Suttur Mata, who later became Sri Shivaratri Rajendra Mahaswamigalu. By the way, I should just mention here, there are about 3,000 matas in Karnataka. So we are talking about a very large number. And they are intimately involved in public life or at various levels. So if you ever Google a Kannada newspaper, be sure that you will see a lot of orange in those newspapers. But the orange is of a very different kind from what we associate today in northern India. And I should just mention this and we can perhaps have a conversation about it. But this mata is again a Lingayat mata in Mysore. And he talks about this epiphanic experience that he has in the late 1920s following his encounter with a young man who was suddenly deprived of the varana, or the weekly boarding that was provided by a family in Mysore. The Swamiji was moved to relinquish the symbols of power, significantly the very honors over which such intense battles had been fought over the past half century or so, to establish and run hostels for young men to study in Mysore in 1941. As it is officially described in the history of the Mata, the hostel, begun with just 10 or 12 students, marked the beginning of an involvement in education for which the Mata is now more than justifiably known. They run something like 212 institutions in the Mysore region. And that's just one Mata. So you can imagine that we're talking about lots and lots of such institutions which are run by Matas. There had been a close link between Matas and hostels from as early as the middle of the 19th century, who followed the lead of the London missionary societies in Bellary and Belgaum. The 20th century opened with a heightened sense of responsibility towards the Lingayat public, which demanded not merely hostels and facilities for living in small towns and cities, but Vidyabhivriddhi, that is learning itself, the competition against the disproportionately large governmental presence of Brahmins. The Sirigiri Mata recognized the importance of enabling Lingayats to avail of modern education by organizing hostels in urban areas for rural students in Harihar and Davangere. They run something like 150 or so institutions. What the system of Varana and Bhikshana had enabled among urban Brahmins in the 20th century was provided on a much larger scale by Lingayat Mathas, particularly Chittadurga, Sirigere, Suttur, Siddhaganga. Siddhaganga was the 109-year-old Mathadipati who passed away just a few months ago. Some of you may have followed it in the national press. That set of institutions is really large in the Tumkur district, running into several hundreds. The protracted struggles of processional honors therefore yielded way to mathas serving new social functions, extending services, particularly in the field of education, to its followers, leaving a far more wholesome and enduring legacy than the cow protection movements of the Indo-Gangetic region. And by way of conclusion, let me just say that while distinguishing the foundational difference between the sannyasi, who is primarily engaged in dharmic duties, this is what M.M. Kalburgi, whom I referred to at the start, had to say about these Lingayat Mathas, which is that he is distinguishing between the sannyasi. So if I can go back to that, this statement, not a statement, it's a kind of it's a proverb. And the reason he uses this proverb is precisely to emphasize that unlike the Brahmin Mathas, which are renunciant, the Lingayat Mathas are those who have a samajamukhi, an engagement with the social, which has developed in this period that I have just discussed. M.M. Kalburgi described the function of the Veerashaiva Mathas in many Karnataka villages as an unofficial government, anadikrita sarkara. That's an interesting phrase, anadikrita sarkara, that is an unofficial government. And he lists the social services rendered by the contemporary matha, serving food, providing education, ensuring health, meting out justice. Meting out justice, I have written on this in the book Iterations of the Law, or promoting literature, and even running cinema halls, while simultaneously tending to spiritual needs. Kalburgi also signaled the more worldly pursuits of mathas, which resulted from this broadened agenda, from running commercial establishments to cinema theatres. The history of the Karnataka Matha in the colonial period, however, is in striking contrast to the emergence from as early as the late 19th century of the political sadhu in the Gangetic belt. As Malavika Kasturi has shown, taking the example of the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal, the development of a more integrated Hindu nation led by Brahmins and monastic orders was achieved principally by mathas successfully resisting their transformation from private religious institutions into publicly accountable ones. This was in part achieved through recasting the modes and languages of philanthropy. Unlike this, no direct engagement with the public political world occurs in Mysore until at least 1964, when the Pejawar Matha Swamiji joined in the founding of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, ostensibly for the restoration and preservation of Dharma. And I should emphasize, of course, the Pejawar Matha Swamiji is a Brahmin Swamiji. No doubt, the commercial and political links of the Mysore or Karnataka Matha have been radically reshaped by the post-independence period of democracy and representative politics as it negotiates the transition from Prabhu Satta Yuga, that is the monarchical age, to the Praja Satta Yuga, or democracy. As Aya Ikegame points out, the Matha comes under the scrutiny of the central government today for tax purposes. The hold of the state government is much weaker. In fact, so I am actually making the argument contrary to my colleagues who are largely anthropologists, who make an argument for the divided sovereignty in the colonial period, that it is today that we are perhaps witnessing this divided sovereignty, that there is a considerable amount of power wielded by mathas in contemporary Karnataka. In part, this is a result of the Karnataka Charitable Endowments and Hindu Religious Institutions Act of 1997 and rules framed by it in 2002 and 2003, which exempted mathas and temples run by mathas from its purview. It would be a mistake to see this as a new or now privatized matha, which has been repeatedly declared unconstitutional by the Karnataka High Court. The new opaqueness of the matha, importantly, occurs alongside its hypervisibility as a supplement of the state. The contemporary Karnataka Matha has shed its colonial incarnation as an institution subordinated to the state. The period I have examined also reveals that the Mysore state may even have achieved greater regional integration in the socio-religious sphere than other parts of the subcontinent, resisting direct engagement with representational politics. You do not see Mathadipatis yearning to stand for elections. They may actually influence elections right from the 1950s. Even our Chief Minister Nijalingappa was actively deployed in taking the support of one or another Matha for his election, but they do not themselves enter the electoral sphere. In its new corporatized form, the Karnataka Matha, even as it occupies the place of an anadikrita sarkara, that is, say, not illegal. Actually, anadikrita sarkara actually means illegal, but anyway, a supplementary government needs to be investigated quite differently from the inaugural moment of its modernity, which this paper has laid out. Okay, so now I'll take questions from you. So I'm basically saying that, and let me show you some of these images of just the, okay, so these are some of the honors. I didn't go into their names because I thought it will unnecessarily confuse you, but they are divided, as I said, into ordinary, special, and royal honors. You have the palanquin, the umbrella, the metal horn. So each of these is a subject of some one or another dispute. Which of these can be used? And I'll show you a few images of this is actually Krishnaraj Wadiyar the third, seeking the blessings of the Parkal Math Swamiji, which again is a 19th century Brahmin Matha which moves to Mysore in order to become, as it were, the family chaplain of the Wadiyar family or the kings. Very restricted in its scope and more or less functioning only as the Matha of the royal family. This is from a line drawing book of which has actually been produced by Krishnaraj Wadiyar himself. So it's a book of illustrations of. This is the throne, as you can see, again, almost resembling a royal throne, very frequently to be seen in mathas even today, although they do not sit in it, the throne, so much these days because they are a little shy of claiming this kind of power. What they do have, however, are individual flags and these government number plates. I mean, so they get some certain kinds of privileges in their cars to distinguish them from ordinary cars. But yes, and this is the Adapalaki, which I've already shown you. This is a picture of Jangama, who is a wandering mendicant, but who is a part of the, there are two types of Lingayat gurus, the Jangama, who is the itinerant guru, and the Sthira, or the person who actually inhabits one place. And the Jangama plays a very important role in cohering the community, as it were. These are some of the honors that are used in processions, which, as I said, many battles were fought about. Maces, the chamara. You can see the chamara, which is the yak's tail on, on the mount. And of course, the torana, or the gate-like structure, the surapanas, that are those two discs. Various kinds of such honors. More such honors. Which type of transportation are you permitted to use? Are you permitted to use covered palaki, that is to say the palanquin or bullock cart? What types of bullock cart? Are you exempt from duties on the streets of Mysore, etc.? These are the kinds of quiz. This is another picture of a Jangama here, of course, fully dressed, again taken from Thurston's Castes and Tribes, and where he is taking on a rather more militant kind of, he's carrying a sword and other armor as well. I took this image of the Sutur Swamijis. As I said, Sutur is a very important matha in Mysore. This is taken from their own publicity booklet, but it's an interesting document because it shows you 3 generations of Swamijis, including the very young Swamiji who's seated to the right. This succession is always decided during the life of the Swamiji himself, who chooses, as it were, his successor in some cases with the help of the caste public, usually the men in the Lingayat community itself. And that's the one who is seated on the right, the really young one, is the one who made the transition to education. So, the one who had that epiphanic moment and so on. So that's the one who's seated there on the right. And this is the Swamiji who inscribed 2 shlokas in 23 volumes and, who's therefore representing a different kind of penance or piety, as it were. Unusual, and as I said, even slightly eccentric, but nevertheless, because it is different from most of the others who are much more engaged with the world of social education and so on and so forth. And here you can see the inauguration of the JSS Mahavidyapeeth in 1959, which today runs, I think I said 270, it's actually 310 institutions. And you can see that they have very close relationship to politicians. Very often the Swamijis are invited to inaugurate government functions. So this is why I say, if you look through a Kannada newspaper, you'll see a lot of orange, because a lot of government, irrigation facilities, other establishments and so on, secular things are actually inaugurated by these Mathadipatis. And they intervene also. I've discussed this in my chapter, in my article, which looks at the interventions in law. Yeah, that's it. So, yeah, now we can have questions.